May God open our eyes to see, our ears to hear, our hearts to love. Amen. It's been a long week in politics and for many of us in personal life. The news from Manus Island of desperate men cast adrift by the Australian government is haunting. Since the announcement of the marriage postal survey, I've gone back to Twitter, which I had ignored happily for a year or more. I follow Lyle Shelton just to keep track of what he's up to, but I have to admit that the Coalition for Marriage parody account is far more enlightening and amusing. It's been a long week as we wait. Is the deadline for the survey passed? And we wait until Wednesday to hear the results. But on Twitter, I also follow Behrouz Booktani, one of the 580 men on Manus Island, a journalist who tweets relentlessly about danger, about 40-degree heat and humidity, about lack of food and water, electricity, lack of health care for a man with untreated kidney stones and another with a heart condition. Through Behrouz Booktani's tweets, I follow the news that is not reported in the news. Squalid living conditions and the desperate measures taken to survive. But also the news of Australian people who are engaging in every imaginable political action to beg the government to change course. It's been a long week in hell on Manus, as the refugees have refused to leave the closed centre for fear of violence. It's been a long week looking at and listening to evil as LNP politicians justify inhumanity and ALP politicians justify collusion. It's been a week of waiting. And the reading that we heard this morning from Matthew's Gospel is about waiting and about being prepared for the waiting, not just for the one who will come. People who know me probably know that I am possibly the world's worst person to be preaching on being prepared, but it's the task I have to do. And this parable about the wise and foolish bridesmaids, this parable about being prepared and waiting, seems at first reading to have very little to offer that is life-giving. I really expected something better from Jesus than the Boy Scouts and Girl Guides motto of be prepared. And I certainly expected something more than look after your own concerns at the expense of others. Is the injunction to watch, to be alert, perhaps to make a virtue of insomnia? I am qualified in that department. Or to perpetuate a culture of watching out, to be forever careful. Perhaps with the current state of world and national affairs, this might be good advice, like some kind of spiritual terror alert. When I read the parable of the wise and foolish bridesmaids, I am grateful that it is not the only parable that we have in which Jesus speaks of the realm of God. It's ungenerous and harsh, not what we'd expect of Jesus revealing God and life to us. It's mean and final and judgmental. Couldn't those smarty-pants bridesmaids have shared their oil? Their actions don't seem very Christian. I'm glad that Jesus told other stories. I am relieved that there are other ways to describe the realm of God that do not involve bridesmaids and oil reserves and doors that will lock half of us out just because we were a little late. Thank goodness for the hope in the sower and the mustard seeds and the other parables, so that we can manage this one parable that depends on not sharing what you have. Is this how we want to define a wise person? Someone who only takes care of herself? Is this the kind of people that we want to be as church? The people who stockpile their oil? Who believe that if other people are in need of liberation or human rights or food or water, then it's their own damn fault? Jesus seems to be contradicting himself in this story. These wise bridesmaids don't seem to be acting in accordance with the Beatitudes. The Jesus who said, "Don't store up treasures on earth" in chapter 6 now tells us in Matthew 25 to keep up large reserves of oil. The Jesus who said, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body or what you will wear," now says, "Worry about your oil, it's the main thing. Worry about whether you have enough for you and forget about everyone else. They're not your problem." The Jesus who said, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you," now says, unless of course you're late, in which case you might as well forget it. Or the Jesus who said, "In everything you do unto others as you would have them do to you," now says, this doesn't apply to oil. Oil changes all the rules. This parable challenges most of the things that I believe about God. If taking care of yourself is the main message of the Gospels, the miracle of the loaves and fishes would never have happened. Jesus wouldn't have fed that hungry crowd. Instead of the feeding of the 5,000, we would have had the moral of the very few who came prepared. Surely we do not want to tell the world, emulate a bunch of smarmy bridesmaids and stingy oil men. We want better for ourselves, for the men of Manus Island, for our country. Of course it is good to be prepared. It would be stupid of me to stand at the lectern this morning without having prepared a reflection. But shouldn't Jesus have more wisdom than a Boy Scout or an insurance agent? So we have to find another way through this parable. I think it might be helpful, rather than focusing on the preparedness, to ask what the oil actually symbolises. Is it something that cannot, in fact, be given away? Protestants are not very into oil in liturgy. However, there are in Catholic and Anglo-Catholic traditions 3 separate oils: the oil of catechumens used at baptism, the oil of the sick for healing and the dying, and the oil of charism used at confirmations and ordinations. Oil has a long history in liturgy in both Jewish and Christian traditions. Jesus is called the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed, and people are always anointed with oil. In Matthew, oil seems to be used in the context of our relationships with one another. Perhaps the oil of God is what brings people together, what brings them together to make their relationships harmonious and justice-based. The oil that we use today in our ordinary lives is most often the cooking oil. In stir-fries, it brings the heat to the various ingredients in an even and homogeneous way. And oil is, of course, also used for lubricating machines like cars. Oil means that the parts slide over each other easily, avoiding that horrible graunching sound that happens when it runs out and the parts cut into each other, eventually destroying the motor. Though our tradition speaks of 3 separate and distinct oils, there is also unity between liberation, salvation, healing, and ordination. Jesus' name, Joshua in Hebrew, means deliverance from and to. It's derived from the Hebrew word that means spacious, to be saved, liberated, to be healed, and to be authorized and enabled to minister to others. Baptism, healing, ordination, and confirmation are all connected. The parable speaks of flasks of oil that are needed to be ready for the celebration of the wedding. In 2 places in the Bible, in Psalm 45 and in Hebrews chapter 1, we find the verse, "God has anointed you with the oil of gladness." With the oil of gladness, it's about joy. Perhaps the flasks of oil are gladness joyfulness, willingness to join in the celebration of the marriage with other people, all sorts of other people as guests. Another way of looking at some sort of oil that cannot be given away is to think about it in terms of our spiritual lives. We have this amazing flame sculpture thing that we use at Pitt Street at Pentecost that some of you may have seen in past years. Concealed at the point of each flame is an oil burner that has a wick in it, so it makes real fire. The first year I used it, some of the flames went out during the Pentecost service. Foolishly, I hadn't checked the oil levels beforehand. If there is no oil in the lamps of our spiritual life, the light goes out, and we have nothing to light the path ahead, and no light of the world to share with others. So today, we might ask ourselves, what fills us up spiritually when we run dry? What replenishes our oil? Where do we find God? And how can we make sure that we get enough of that oil for our lamp so that God can fill us up again? Because we will run dry. We all run dry. And when we do, we can't be a light for anyone. You probably know the signs in your life when you're running out of oil. For me, it's too busy to cook. For many of us, it's too preoccupied with our own worries to be present to the needs of other people or to turn our attention to the voices crying for justice in our world. For many of us, it's that we're too distracted to have a real conversation with our partners or dear friends about anything other than logistics or domestic concerns. So it seems there are some kinds of oil that you can't borrow from anyone else. There are some kinds of preparation that we can only do for ourselves. There are some reserves that no one can build up for us. You can't borrow someone else's peace of mind or their passion for the sacred. You can't say to your friend, "You have such a happy relationship, could you give me some of that?" It just doesn't work. You have to find it yourself. You have to figure out what fills you up spiritually, and then make sure that you have some to carry with you every single minute of every day, because that's how often you'll need it. But even so, you will run out. Time will run out. The hour gets late. Everyone gets sleepy. We all doze. We all put off the things that really, really matter. In the end, the oil that fuels you is going to come from what fuels you spiritually, right now. It's going to come from where you see God, where you find the sacred today. And where is that? Well, Jesus tells us in some of those other more light-filled parables and stories. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you comforted me. That's where we will find Jesus today. That's where we will get filled up. That's where we gather the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All of those things that we can't borrow from our friends. So you don't fill up your lamp because you're afraid that you're going to get locked out of the realm of God. You don't stockpile oil because then you can turn everyone else away, and that's so much fun. No, you stop at the filling station and you fill your flask and you take it with you, because you can't wait to encounter the Christ in Christa community. You fill your flask with oil out of joy. And in joy, we touch the deep wells of our spiritual tradition, the tradition of justice-making, the vision of Amos, where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And we connect with theologians of our time, like Carter Hayward, whose prophetic poetry calls us to lives of mutuality, to lives of love, to lives of liberation for ourselves and for others. In Carter's words, remembering that we are called to love, she says, "To love you is to be pushed by a power, God, both terrifying and comforting. To touch and be touched by you. To love you is to sing with you, cry with you, pray with you, and act with you to recreate the world." To say "I love you" means let the revolution begin. God bless the revolution. Amen.